It will be.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, a very warm welcome to today's UCL Catalyst seminar. So this seminar series is designed to spark fresh thinking and debate, particularly on the crucial topic of children and young people's mental health. It features cutting-edge work by UCL researchers. And the idea really is to foster new connections between scientists, clinicians, policymakers in a range of disciplines. And today we're going to be considering a topic of enormous importance that's become such a significant part of the national conversation, namely, as Sabrina already mentioned, digital technology and social media and the mental health of children and young people. And we're very lucky to have two excellent researchers and speakers today, Dr. Marc Tibber and Dr. Martin Dechant, who are doing groundbreaking and impactful work in this area. So we're going to hear first from Marc, who'll talk for about 20 minutes. And then we'll have a few minutes for questions specifically on his presentation before moving on to Martin's talk. And then after that, there'll be time for questions specifically on Martin's talk, as well as for a wider, sort of general discussion and questions. So firstly, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Marc Tibber. Marc is a senior clinical psychologist and lecturer in clinical psychology at UCL, specializing in emerging adult mental health. His recent work has focused on the role of interpersonal and social processes in mental health, particularly computer-mediated communication, and how issues of connection and disconnection affect individuals and communities. And his talk is entitled Mental Health in a Digital Age, a Cognitive Behavioral Conceptualization to Support Healthy Social Media Use. So thanks, Marc, and over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. So that isn't the title of my talk. Apologies, I've sort of ended up with a brief title, but hopefully it's same relevance. I'm going to be talking, a lot of my work is actually on adolescents and emerging adults. But I think a lot of it, I have done a lot of work with younger age groups, children as well, and I think most of it, if not all of it, is relevant to younger age groups as well. But just to give that kind of caveat, some of the research I'll be talking about will be about older young people. So I just wanted to give a bit of context about my interest in the field. So I worked in a community child and adolescent mental health service. And there was one particular young person that I was working with who I found out later was autistic. But at the time when I was working with him, he was very socially withdrawn and he was neat. So he wasn't in education, he wasn't in training, and he dropped out of college. And he was spending 6 hours plus online. And there was understandably quite a lot of concern from his family and people in his network. And something that really struck me is I'd been working with him for a number of months. I was very lucky. It was a sort of context in which I could work with him for a year or longer. And it was only about 3 years in that I realized that everyone that he was telling me about, these intimate relationships, these friendships, all of them were online, and he'd never actually met any of them offline at all. But during the process of our therapy together and our work together, he decided, he connected with a special interest group online, and he decided to go across the other side of the world to go to a conference that was dedicated to this group. I was really nervous. I think everyone in his network was quite nervous, but working together and thinking about how to do that safely, he actually obtained some work to fund the trip. He went out there, a lot of his online friends transferred to the offline world, and his confidence grew. And when he got home, it generalized, and he got into a training program and entered to work. Now, I'm not saying that every client I've seen by any means, this is the sort of thing, a typical situation. But what it really highlighted to me is that social media has this capacity to sort of feed withdrawal and disconnection from the world. So it can be a risk to mental health and well-being, but it also can be a real source of connection and identity consolidation, etc. And so it can be a real benefit as well. So my research was kind of seeded by this and sort of related experiences to kind of ask what influences this potential either towards the harms or the benefits of social media, of which I think there are many, and can we target that clinically? So just to kind of broaden the perspective a little bit, why should we care about social media as clinicians, as researchers in the sort of field of mental health? Well, one is it's just hugely prevalent, sort of bordering on ubiquitous now. Second, not only that, but it's elevated in young people with mental health difficulties. So people with mental health difficulties are more likely to use social media every day. They're more likely to use social media for longer. They're more likely to be cyberbullied. And in that context, there is this concern by some that it may be causal, that the increase in social media use may be driving increases in mental health difficulties, and these increases are, I think, really quite clear. Jonathan Haidt being one of the strongest advocates of this, and one of his main sources of evidence, not his only, but his main sources of evidence, is this real steep increase in mental health difficulties from around about 2010, 2012 onwards, which is when 2007 was the release of the iPhone, and it's when sort of smartphones became really prevalent. And clinically, we tend to ignore it. That's my experience in services. And just sort of informally, when I run trainings on the clinical psychology doctorate, I sort of ask trainees how much they encounter issues of social media use in their clinical work and how much they ask about it. And about two-thirds to three-quarters of trainees say that it sometimes or always comes up in their clinical work, but the same proportions say that they rarely or never ask about it. So it's important. It's very important for young people. It's very important for young people with mental health difficulties, and yet clinically we're not asking about it. So just briefly, I mean, it's a very brief talk, but what does the research tell us? Well, if we look at the systematic reviews and meta-analyses, I mean, in terms of individual studies within those syntheses of the data, we find that there's lots of harms and benefits that are highlighted. If we look at cross-sectional data, we tend to find there's small associations, relatively robust, but small associations. I just recently had another look at sort of updated literature, and this just some examples. But in this case, there's a small association between amount of social media use and internalizing symptoms. But if we look at more sort of robust evidence in terms of experimental interventions and those sorts of experimental designs, we find a mixture. So one study finds no effects of abstinence, another finds small and heterogeneous effects on well-being, small effects on depression, but not well-being, life satisfaction, and stress. And of course, more recently, very topical because of the ban in Australia and what looks like could be a ban in England around school phone bans. Recent reviews of the evidence suggest either little to no conclusive evidence that mobile phone bans impact on mental health, or sort of evidence for small effects. So what's going on? We're finding complex, mixed findings, small effects differential effects depending on outcomes. And I think really what is a growing recognition is that the devil is in the detail. And I'm going to reference a little bit of research, some of which we've undertaken and many others have undertaken as well. And which is perhaps unsurprisingly that individual differences matter. So age, gender, some of the work we've done has shown attachment style moderates the impact of social media use on mental health. Amy Orban has done some great work looking at what she calls sort of these windows of developmental sensitivity, that there may be particular periods in people's lives and young people's lives when they're particularly vulnerable to negative effects of social media. And certainly with respect to one of these periods, the earlier period, they may be slightly offset in boys and girls. We've shown work that one's motivations for engagement matter in terms of impact, the behaviors you engage in impact, but also from the technological side, platforms have differential effects, and features and affordances of those platforms moderate some of those effects. So there's just recently a really nice study came out looking at 100-day study on the impact of social media in adolescent mental health, and showing that actually different platforms have different effects. So again, perhaps unsurprisingly, what we find is that there's a complex interplay between the individual and technology-related factors. And there is this move away from what's sometimes called a causationist assumption or a deterministic assumption that social media is good or it is bad, to a more contextualist assumption. In other words, the recognition that who's using it, who they're connecting with, what they're doing on it, why they're doing it, when they're doing it, is really, really important. So what does this mean clinically? So I developed, along with a colleague, Emma Silva, a conceptualization of the ways, a cognitive behavioral conceptualization of the ways that social media interacts with mental health in adolescents. And what we did is we just basically we tried to integrate what is out there in terms of existing research, theory, and clinical experience, our clinical experience in talking to colleagues that work with young people and adolescents. And the purpose of it was that we wanted to make sense of existing research from a clinical perspective, and in the process help clinicians to assess and formulate the role of social media in common mental health difficulties. So focus on the sort of things you would see in community mental health services, so things like anxiety and depression. And where indicated, direct treatment to integrate this understanding of social media and its role in mental health. If it's not implicated, obviously we wouldn't say this is, we wouldn't say integrate it if it's not needed. But if it is through the process of assessment, then to integrate it with the idea that it might then inform also the development of interventions, basically to support young people to use social media in the service of their values, their interests, and long-term well-being. What it didn't set out to do was to pathologize social media use. It's also not a conceptualization of social media addiction. It's not trying to capture the sort of extreme patterns of use where people are using it all day, 14, 15 hours a day, which, people, it's not unheard of. And the idea is not to conceptualize more extreme or less common social media experiences. So it's the idea of understanding these everyday pervasive, as a Freudian slip there, pervasive impacts of everyday ongoing use and how that intersects with our mental health. Again, I haven't got masses of time, but just to give you an overview of the conceptualization, at its core is a CBT cycle. And we adopted that because CBT is the main modality that's adopted in the UK and many other countries, and we wanted it to be accessible and understandable to clinicians. So at the core of these thoughts, feelings, sensations, and behaviors that we're all familiar with. And the core idea is at the first past the post, social media tends to be beneficial when it leads to increased connection. It's not the only driver, but a major driver, particularly with young people, where these social processes are so important, so integral, that when connection increases through use, that's when the benefits in terms of impact, mood, mental health, and well-being are accrued. And the harms tend to be accrued when it drives further sense of disconnection and isolation. And critically, there are targetable conditions or sort of contexts under which this is more likely. So we propose, on an integration of the research and our clinical experience, that when engagement is driven and underpinned by motivations and behaviors that involve social enhancement or enhancement, in other words, approaching things and people of value and importance to the person, then they're much more likely to experience greater connection and the benefits of engagement. And also critically, when you engage in an intentional, purposeful, or mindful way of use, so you're aware of what you're going on for, how long you've been on, you're aware of the impact on your mood, etc., then you tend to get the benefits. On the flip side, when you engage with motivations and in behaviors that are escapist or avoidant, so you're trying to escape the challenges of offline interactions, when you're looking for kind of frictionless social interactions, then you tend to increase your sense of disconnection. You sort of become more isolated from the world. And also critically, when you mindlessly engage, so you just automatically engage, you habitually pick up your phone, you're much more likely to increase disconnection. And without going into massive depth, hopefully you can see how these could interact. So as a caricature, from a mindful sort of nature of engagement, someone who goes on and goes, right, I want to go on, I'm going to go on for half an hour, I'm going to connect with my family abroad, I want to share some photos with them and just, cultivate that sense of connection. Then you tend to get benefits. The other side, the caricature, is someone who goes on, they have a negative offline experience, they're struggling socially, they go and they just doom scroll, they passively view material, they get pulled by the algorithms and they make lots of social comparisons, and it drives a sense of disconnection and drives down their self-esteem. The model also talks about technological features and how these interact with these processes. It suggests that actually the same technological features the technological features that exist are linked to both harms and benefits. So, for instance, the fact that social media allows you to connect with huge audiences both offers masses of opportunities to connect you with people, like-minded people, people with shared interests. And we've got lots of our research shows how, particularly, for instance, people from stigmatized groups or minoritized groups can really benefit from that sense of connection and community and shared identity. But likewise, by accessing a huge audience, it also increases the chances that you're going to be trolled, that you're going to experience a replication of that same discrimination and stigma that you experience offline. But also the last point is that in the absence of active effort, persuasive design, right? So the algorithmic capture, the infinite scroll, the automatic replay, all those sorts of things are going to drag you towards more mindless engagement and hence some of these harms, you know. So the fact that the algorithms tend to show you sensationalizing, catastrophizing material is much more likely to trigger anxious feelings and you know, make you engage in a much more automatic and habitual way. So just very briefly, I want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing to see if this model, kind of this conceptualization fits. We've got a lot of studies sort of supporting it, but just to name a couple, drawn from some of the Dechant Sci trainees that have been working with me. So quantitatively, we explored the model. We looked at we recruited 352 emerging adults online, and we just asked them to reflect on everyday typical positive and negative social media experiences. So things that they found, you know, that had been positive experiences in their life or negative, and we presented them in counterbalanced order and looked at them to report on their motivations, their behaviors, and the sort of the nature of their engagement. And what we found is, in line with the model, the conceptualization, is that compared to recalling negative online experiences, participants were much more likely to report they engaged with motivations to enhance social connections, to increase, to build on their relationships when they were reflecting on these positive experiences. They were less likely to report escapist use when they had these positive experiences. In terms of behaviors, they were more likely to report engaging in active use. So they would share material, they would comment, they would send material to friends and colleagues. There was no significant effect of passive use. If you want to, we could talk about it in the questions, but that didn't come out significant. But also, they reported that when they had positive experiences, they were much more likely to report on having initiated the session. So it's basically picking up their phones and logging on social media mindfully and intentionally, and much more likely to have reported engaging in a mindful way. And we've also done some work qualitatively exploring the fit of this conceptualization in emerging adults. We use framework analysis. And just to pull out a couple of themes, again, when we had them reflect on positive experiences, the same sort of themes came out, that there was this sense that in positive experiences, they were much more likely to engage in a kind of intentional way that both often led to positive effects, greater connection, that sort of thing, but also itself was positive experiences, positive because it gave them a sense of agency. So you can see theme one, intentional engagement, promoting agency. I've intentionally deleted things online with my values. It's not just scrolling anymore, it's more purposeful. And I'll miss theme two in the interest of time for the moment, but negative experiences, again, there was this theme that came out. The flip side of that is that there was this automatic engagement and the loss of agency that was commonly experienced when they were having negative online experiences. So the classic thing of going down a rabbit hole, coming home and finding that before they'd even realize it, they'd lost 2 hours of their life, which often left them open to the kind of algorithmic pull of, you know, heavy curated, idealized other people's posts and the social comparisons that emerge, but also just undermined their sense of agency and control. My other work, I work a lot with young people in the public eye, musicians, professional musicians. There's some published work showing that the model really sort of captures people's experiences in that industry. We've also looked at the model in autistic people, and found that it has a good fit. In all cases, we've kind of adapted the model and updated it slightly, but in broad principle, we found good support for the model. We've also just undertaken a systematic review looking at the interaction between mindfulness, social media use, and well-being, and find there's not masses of evidence out there, but there's accruing evidence that mindfulness does, in fact, mediate or moderate the relationship between, partially moderate or mediate the relationship between social media and mental health. We've published stuff supporting this idea that more approach motivation, so using it for enhancement rather than escape, is associated with better outcomes. And also that the social media context itself transforms some of these cognitive, behavioral, and attentional processes. It's not just that the online world mirrors the offline, it actually transforms some of these cognitive, behavioral, and attentional processes. And we're now looking at developing intervention studies on the basis of these of this work to try and target some of these processes to strengthen that kind of mindful, intentional engagement. I've also just to put Grand Challenges down there because they've kindly given us some funding to look at the role of AI in young people's lives, and particularly chatbot use. Because increasingly in our interviews with people and young people in particular, we're finding you can't study social media and its impact on mental health without understanding AI, both in terms of algorithms and both in terms of chatbots. So we're going to be developing materials, going into schools and developing materials and for teachers and parents to support young people to use AI in ways that support their mental health and to understand how they are using it. So I realized maybe just the last minute or two, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the clinical implications of this model as I see, which we're already using in my clinical role. We've already been using some of this work to sort of steer treatment and interventions. The first thing is, if you take nothing from this and you disagree with everything I say, that's absolutely fine. But what I would definitely say is, please ask about your clients' online lives. It's such an integral part of people's lives, and for so many people's lives. And I think we have been neglecting it for too long. When integrating this into your work, I think it's really important to think about benefits and harms of which have been well documented and are clearly sort of out there and robust, but also thinking about it as a context for intervention. So I've used sort of online world as a form of exposure, as a form of challenging thoughts, trialing out sort of social skills and this kind of thing, and integrate this work into assessment formulation and intervention if and where it's indicated, not if it's not. The ultimate aim on the basis of this model is to cultivate digital literacy and including an understanding of the interaction between the kind of design features that are built into these models, into these technologies and incentives, and try to cultivate an understanding of how they interact with core psychological processes. And with the ultimate aim of cultivating mindful, intentional engagement in line with values. I haven't spoken about values, but I think values is a good, practical, heuristic way of aligning people's motivations and behaviors with these kind of more approach behaviors, approaching things and people they care about, rather than supporting them to move away from kind of escapist or avoidant use of the technology. And in that process, it might not necessarily be, and I've worked with people where it's not necessarily about helping them to use technology, less, it might be even using it more, but it's about using it more mindfully, intentionally, like we said, and using the technology more critically. So it might be about using different platforms, managing the settings, implementing boundaries, reflecting on what parts of self they want to share and they don't share. And if you're interested from a clinical perspective, in the paper I described, we include a bunch of clinical vignettes and ideas for how to integrate these principles in assessment, formulation, and treatment. Some publications, and these are the growing number of people that I want to thank for doing projects with me or collaborating with me over the years, and hopefully as roughly on time.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Great talk, and very, very impressive timekeeping too. As I mentioned before, we've got time if we want for just a couple of specific questions about Mark's presentation. You can put your hand up and ask a question verbally, or you can type something in the chat. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Mark about his presentation? I mean, I found myself. Oh, did Alexandra, is that a hand up from you?
It's an old-fashioned hand.
Excellent. I like it. Old school. Okay.
Well, I was just thinking about, when you try and have a conversation with adolescents about the harms of social media, there's a lot of kind of eye rolling and inability to relate it to their immediate gains, priorities, let's say. And there seems to be some really useful advice in here to young people, as well as more broadly as a kind of policy suggestion around, it's great to use social media if you're doing all the positive paradigms that you described. It's not great if you use it in this way, some of which they know, but of course, this is evidenced and coming from an academic stroke clinical team, it kind of has a bit more of a veneer of authenticity. But how do we see this translating into really persuasive interventions for young people that they're actually going to listen to? Because yeah, I feel like there could be a way of working with young people so that young people are persuading their peers of the benefits we're seeing in this research. But is there any, are there any advances in that kind of work? Because the peer-to-peer approach feels a bit more than the elder to younger approach, feels more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I would say, I mean, I've gone into schools and done some literacy work and explored some of these issues. I mean, my experience, and I don't know, I'd be interested to hear if yours is different, but actually, I found young people to be very reflective on some of these issues, and actually to talk very eloquently and sophisticatedly about some of these problems. So when you say to sort of be more persuasive, do you mean to convince them of the importance or to actually overcome some of the challenges of implementing
Well,
these strategies in their lives?
I think there's some issues with cognitive dissonance. So I think that, like, for example, we all know the health risks of drinking, but a lot of us will drink alcohol and have a bit of optimistic bias about that. And I think that we can spend 2 hours on Twitter looking at, rather intriguing political chat and have an awareness that it's probably not brilliant for us, but we're still doing it. And I mean, by analogy, we're doing some work at UCL in human computer interaction and mental health, where we try and create a way of screening press reporting of suicide so that you can give it a sort of score of how damaging it is in the terms of irresponsible language. So are there apps where you could you could have something on screen which almost says, look, you've just spent 40 minutes reading about the American election, and
Yeah.
this is its or Taylor Swift's tour outfits. This is the measure of
Yeah.
your age, gender, and other characteristics. This is how damaging this has been for you. Because I think that would be valuable for all of us, and you can ignore it or take it on board. But at the moment, they'll be looking at Taylor Swift for 2 hours, enjoying it, have an awareness it's not great, but still do it. And so I'm just thinking about ways. I mean, this is not coming from a young person, this idea. So I want to know whether they would find that useful. They can always mute it, they can always ignore it, but I don't know, what do they want to help them guide their use of social media?
I mean, I know I'm not, I haven't got a great grasp of all the literature on the different types of interventions, but I think that some of the stuff I have read is that one of the problems is when you put in these technological solutions or kind of nudge solutions. So when they open it up, they ask, do you really want to open this app? Do you want you try and increase mindfulness, make it a little bit more difficult so you delete the app from your phone? What you often find is I think that people just habituate to that and just get slightly frustrated that it takes them longer to log on. One thing we've found that has been really useful is having gaps, working with young people and having gaps between sessions, doing some of this literacy work, and then just getting them to reflect on it over the course of a week or 2 weeks. And actually, even just monitoring their use. And we've often found people have come back and gone, I just did not realize the extent of which I'm using it. And that's been an incentive to change. Some people have come back and gone, actually, I've reflected on my use and I've kind of monitored. And I don't think I need to change how I'm using it. I think I'm using it very healthily,
Yeah.
which I think is really important. The other component that I think is really important is that I think one of the problems with this research and that I'm coming at trying to understand this problem is I think there's a real question of what is the temporal scale that these problems are operating over, but also what are the spatial scale. So I work when I've worked with young people around these issues, I think one of the blocks might not be about their own use and changing, but there's a question about whether this is a more of a kind of community problem or a social problem. And it's so one of the vignettes in the paper we talk about is a young lady who decided that she wanted to use social media less. It was really unhelpful. It was driving social comparisons. She learned to kind of reflect and monitor how it was impacting on her self-esteem, and she deleted all her social media apps. And what she found was that therefore she didn't get invited to anything. It completely disconnected her from her social group, and she lost all sources of connection and organizing her social life. So I think that is another major problem, which is that if you change your use, but you're part of a social group that doesn't, and this is why there's interest now, I think, in going into whole schools and supporting families to get their children off phones rather than just it being an individual problem. I know running out of time probably. The other thing I would say is I think just to recognize that, you know, like any habit, like any problem, I don't think there is a simple, straightforward, I don't think in one session you're going to be able to do this. I think like any behavioral change, it's complicated. It's driven by short-term reinforcers as well as long-term and social forces. And so my experiences when I've worked with this clinically, it's about exploring it. They try and make changes. They come back next week and they've made some changes and they slip back and relapse. But change is possible, but it's not, it's not do one session, that's going to solve it. It's an issue like every other one we see clinically, and interacts with all the other clinical issues. It relates to their other social networks, their other habits, their other support networks, and yeah. Sorry if that's a bit of a long-winded answer.
No, it's all really important stuff, and thanks very much for that. And we'll have more time at the end for further discussion as well. And Ralph, thanks for posting that. That's a reminder to me as well that do feel free to post things in the chat as we go along. And so then you'll sort of have your question or your comment lodged there ready for our discussion at the end. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Martin Dechant. Martin's a computer scientist and lecturer in digital mental health and the founder of UCL's Digital Mental Health Hub. His research focuses on the design and evaluation of digital technologies such as AI, games, and immersive systems for mental health assessment. And more recently, his work has expanded to explore fashion, cybercrime, and playful design, with a focus on developing psychologically ergonomic digital technologies. And Martin's talk is going to be talking to us about growing up digital, designing for mental health in a screen-first world. So thanks very much, Martin, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Will. And thank you for having me in this wonderful space. As Will already said, like I'm a computer scientist, so sometimes there's like when I'm working with clinicians and mental health experts, and sometimes there's like a different understanding of like, okay, how does mental health work? And I think that's something which is quite interesting. So I think Mark already in the first part already talked about it. It's like we think about like technology is something we are treating it in a very weird and odd way. If you think about it, it's like um, I think I can easily ask the questions like a little bit interactions like who in the chat thinks that they don't need a smartphone? So I see that nobody is raising their hand. That's already a good sign. So I still have a job. But the interesting point what I wanted to raise is like um, the majority of us like have now an internet access. The majority have a mobile phone, and at least also the majority is also on a social media platform and engaging on these digital platforms. Exactly. So like, okay, everything is on my phone, and if you think about like a couple of years ago, you still had like you had your cash. Your credit cards, whatever, it's like now everything is on the phone. So the digital transformation is getting faster and faster and faster. And it is quite challenging for not only computer scientists, but also from a mental health perspectives, like how does these digital changes affect our mental well-being? So, um, within the human-computer interaction space, which is like a speciality of computer science, which is the overlap between hardcore engineering of digital platforms, of tools, program software, whatever, and it's like the question around like, okay, the user needs to interact with the system. We have like the questions like, okay, where do people like to have digital technologies involved? And it's like the majority we asked, there's like, okay, refilling medication, also like preparations for the visit, reviewing text results, receiving education. But the interesting point was in this survey from 2022 is that the majority was actually thinking about like, okay, mental health support is something which they actually didn't like to engage on digital platforms. There were like questions like, okay, is actually the digital platform like Zoom, um, or even chatbots like at that time, actually something quite helpful. But what we see recently in the discussion is like the chatbots and like ChatGPT, Claude, or like some of the more advanced companionship apps becoming more and more sophisticated and becoming more and more interweaved into the social fabric of a lot of users. So, but then also, of course, there's like the question around in this survey, that there's like, of course, a gender identity difference between like, for example, men had a lot of preferences for addressing mental health issues compared to other genders. Why do I bring these old informations up? Well, I'm always asking my computer scientists and like also the mental health experts, like, where do you place on the wonderful rainbow of health determinants? Where do you place technology here now? It's like if you think about what we heard before. Sorry, I just need to open the chat again so that I can communicate with you guys. If you think about like, where do you place technology here now? Do you think it's like it's a lifestyle factor? Is it a social community factor? It is something which starts more and more to affect all these kinds of sub aspects. Exactly. Julia is like on my side everywhere. That's perfect. Um, yes, and sometimes there's like people who are arguing it's like, hey, actually it's like agriculture and food production. Where's that? It's like even there's like you have already right now it's like for example that people are starting to use AI systems and support systems to manage their diet. So like they're offloading their food intake, which we're exploring right now, is like and offloading it to a chatbot and they're basically asking, hey, ChatGPT, make me food. And then basically they get recipes based on what they have in the smart fridge or in the fridge, and then saying like, okay, is this enough? We don't know. But it's like the interesting thing is like this misconception that the digital technology is understanding me perfectly. It's like this black box magic where I can basically, it's like I throw in my problem, it comes perfectly solved out. And it's like more and more spreading all over the different determinants of health, which becomes on one side, of course, can become quite helpful in saying like, okay, it's becoming more accessible. But then on the other side, it becoming, of course, a potential risk. And so like in this talk, basically, what I want to challenge you was like take you on a journey from a technology perspective, like what human-computer interaction experts and computer scientists how do they approach these kinds of questions around like how do we design and how do we interact with systems so that you when your question is like getting exposed to these technologies can start to bring your own thoughts into like having it's like also that I think it's like the vocabulary to enter these discussions. So I bring it here right now. It's like an interesting framework where basically it's like in 2024, Corbett and colleagues tried to basically map design principles which are linked to the child to playful design for children into the needs and principles of children rights. And as you can see here, on one side, like what they're saying is like, okay, technology designed for children should be on one side welcoming, so features that are inclusive, sociable, and welcoming to it all. But also, and it is quite interesting, coming now building on Marc's talk about social media, it's like it's explicitly saying it's like, okay, design for children should focusing on reducing actually is like hateful communication and forms of inclusion, also trying to accommodate for multiple identities. Now, there I think we are a very diverse community today. I don't know if we can ask like who identifies as gamer, but for example, a lot of game communities struggle right now. It's like to say, it's like, how do we tackle the question around hateful communication? And also, game platforms get abused or misused. As a as a platform where basically hate speech is growing, and game designers and game developers are basically right now struggling severely. It's like, how do we tackle that? Of course, one question is like one problem is like the misunderstanding or misconceptualization where hate speech is like this kind of anger comes from. Um, and then building on that, like the next step is like the enhancing of the imagination, where we're saying like, okay, provide creative spaces where they can explore ideas. Um, and there's also like this kind of questioning around like, okay, what is the role of advertising and commercial pressure in there? Um, where we have like this kind of lately in digital technologies, the push towards, okay, it needs to be profitable. And therefore, of course, like two commercial aspects get introduced. So, for example, the features in games, for example, get put behind a paywall. So in order, if I want to fully enjoy the game, I have to pay extra. And then, of course, like couple of years ago, there were great examples where basically a huge title in the Harry Potter franchise caused controversy because it was a children game, but then the game stopped. Where a character was in immediate danger, and you could either wait and let your hero character almost die and see that on the screen versus you have to pay £5 and then it's like the crisis is evaded. So like you have these kinds of deceptive designs which we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes. So this is basically is like what I'm showing you here is like right now it's like the idea when you are becoming a user experience designer. You want to design basically it's like user-centered first, like you want to address like all their needs, but then of course there's like the pressure of the technology and like of course the profitability which we can basically always get confronted when launching or when running these kinds of digital systems. So I want to take a little bit journey about like a little bit of my work, a little bit like outlook, what's out there, and like hopefully spark some discussions in the chat and in the questions in a moment. So, which platforms and data do we choose? Like on one side, of course, we have like the question around social data. It's like, okay, my social network, who am I interacting with, how long I'm interacting with them, etc. It's like, okay, human to human interaction. But then, of course, like we have sensor data. And again, I'm raising this one in a moment, like about sensors. And then, of course, the final part, which is my major, one of my major interests, is this kind of question around interaction behavioral data, where we basically are looking into, okay, users in digital spaces produce a lot of behavioral data around like, okay, how do they interact with the system? Where do they stop? What do they interact with it? Where do they interact with systems? So I look how you interact with the system reveals a lot, can reveal a lot about your mental well-being. So we're going into the sensors. So like I don't know how much you are aware, but you are carrying a lot of sensors around with you when you have a phone with you. So like we have on one side, like with your phone, of course, I can have location sensors where I can say it's like, okay, where are you physically? In which space are you? How close are you to other people? So if you remember the COVID times, like we had all the social connections tracking apps, and then basically it's like this kind of technology was all around like Bluetooth connections, Wi-Fi connections, like where was I connected, in which room, who was in this room with me, etc. But then additionally, it's like you have also other sensors, like for example, I can track like the 3D position and the acceleration of this phone, and basically start to track, okay, are you running, are you standing, are you biking? So based on just simple shaking your phone, I can basically detect like, okay, your movement patterns. And these kinds of technologies like the combination of location sensors, and movement sensors had already been used within UCL here in computer science to predict like levels of depression using basically it's like, okay, where are you going out, and so like these kinds of matrices. Additionally, is like which is becoming more and more prominent is the presence of cameras. So in the early days of the phone, we had only one camera backside facing, and nowadays you have at least like front side camera, backside camera, and then you have multiple sub cameras implemented, like infrared cameras, etc. And then of course, like if I'm holding my finger on the camera here, I can detect already like blood pressure and it's these kinds of information. And then additionally, it's like with the phones, like having an infrared camera up in here, can start like detect like also blood pressure through the face skin. And then basically it's like on that's like I'm getting a lot of behavioral not behavior, but like body sensors, body informations. So just some simple examples, like what happened there's like with your phone, what I can do is basically, I think a lot of you probably know these kinds of sleep tracking apps. Like I'm putting the phone on my bed or next to my bed, and then basically through the movement of the mattress and the movement data here, I can get like can predict correlate your PHQ-9 scoring, for example. And I'm not saying that this is like basically replacing the PHQ assessment, but it is something which is quite interesting. It's like basically to think about like how can we use behavioral data in that space, like to enhance assessment techniques, building beyond combining like the subjective measurements or subjective assessments in combination with empirical, not empirical, sensory data, which can then basically enhance like the evidence-based assessment. Procedures. So this is basically one of my favorite works, which is also getting replicated now by Elizabeth Hogg from the AIM lab. So what we did there in this lab, in this experiment, we were asking how players move around in gaming tasks with levels of social anxiety. And I'm breaking it down right now quite drastically. So what we asked participants to do is like, okay, they have to approach the stranger. You can see it on top there. The stranger was either friendly or aggressive to them. And then they had to bypass the stranger and go to the elevator. Now, in a nutshell, what we see is basically we have two patterns. Like people with low social anxiety, they bypass the strangers, like the NPC, not playable character, quite close. They didn't avoid it at all. Versus in the game, as you can see here, people with high levels of social anxiety started to walk further around the stranger, try to stand further away from them, and this even in a gaming environment. So what we can see here is basically is like the transition from behavioral patterns from the physical world into the digital world. So this is right now is like a very obvious scenario where we're basically saying it's like okay the biased perception of the distance in the social space is something which is also remanifesting in the digital space, and now we're trying to replicate this also in the body dysmorphic disorder space. But the interesting point, what I wanted to say here is like, as you can see, it's like a very simple behavioral measurements. Like, okay, how do you move in a game? Now, what can this tell us about you as a player? And now, of course, the big question. Okay, yes, games, social media, phone data, but what about the big AI threat? So I have this wonderful thing building on Marc's comment about like, okay, we need to study AI and social media together. And I completely agree because in 2022, it was TikTok, which was now the new search engine for information for young people. But nowadays, it's basically you can rewrite this whole article and it's basically like that. So what you can do is right, or what's happening is right now is like rather than saying like okay they're googling and searching for that, you have Google Gemini which is summarizing all the informations on top of it. So like basically it's like taking away the autonomy from the user, saying okay which information is basically I want to perceive, and you're getting dished out an AI generated summary where you can questions like is the quality actually there, is it harmful, is it riskful. So overall, in previous work, what we see there's like, okay, in AI spaces, what we can do is like, of course, we have like AI is a massive term in computer science, like in engineering. It's like it's a lot of times like we are right now misusing AI just as like these chatbots and LLM systems. But like in the early days, it was all around this kind of pattern recognitions, machine learnings, like how can we basically have these raw data from sensors, from games, from service, like how can we build patterns and like identify mental health needs building on these kinds of behavioral data. So like this is something which is going on for years and years and years, and it's quite powerful to say it's like okay, what are the behavioral patterns in digital spaces and in physical spaces. Um, but then, of course, like there's the question around like, okay, we have now also the data and the quality of the data is something which is affecting the quality of your model. So in the early days of ChatGPT, for example, you had also like of these chat systems, you had weird phrases and words coming up, and basically it came out of the problem of these kinds of digital systems, which is like the digital colonialism, where basically the labor of data labeling is outsourced to other countries which have a different English dialect, and then basically this English dialect from other countries get then slipped into the data labeling, and then basically it's like reappearing in the models. Like you can see that there's like this kind of data quality, and it's like also the demand for more fresh data. And then, of course, that's basically like when it comes to these kinds of systems, and why I want to emphasize this, like this understanding that it is not black magic. There's like always an engineer who's like somebody sitting behind these systems who's designing and crafting them for a certain goal. Now, the question is like, what is the goal? Is it the goal for the user is it the user's goal, or is it the designer's goal, which is the system focusing on? We have one latent work where we basically looked into how we can use these kinds of chatbot systems in promoting well-being in young people in UCL. It's like what we did there is basically we ask young people for 2 weeks to engage with a chatbot which called Future Me, which was focusing on promotion of prospections. Like basically the system was designed that they are talking with themselves from the future, and then basically through sophisticated questions, they're basically always asked like, okay, think about like what are the options right now? What can you do? And long story short, what we have here is like that we have that these systems or that system was mostly used for discussions around like the education and career goals. So questions around, okay, how should I study? What are the next steps for my career? Any personal obstacles? But which is also interesting was also the question around relationship concerns. Like we had questions around like, okay, should I go out? Should I meet these people? Should I date this person? So basically, the chatbot turns into almost a date doctor, which is then like filtering out like what are suitable social connections for the user. The important point is the effectiveness is quite context dependent of these systems, where the prospection techniques was more suitable for the broader lifetimes decisions, like okay, should I engage, should I study, should I do this and this and this, rather it's like okay, accurate stress situations. The interesting thing around this is, and if you follow it up, is how large language models and open chatbots are right now more and more pushing into this story around like the AI therapist. It's like how can we actually use an AI therapist in that? And it is something which is quite controversial and something I want to discuss with you because you are the experts in the field. We're basically saying, where we're basically asking ourselves, okay, where are the limitations of these kinds of technologies and where are the challenges of applying these kinds of technologies? And I'm coming now to for the last 2 minutes to the digital hazards for our users. So, where are our Netflix binge watchers? So, what we have here is like the question around like designing for who and for what. So, like for example, in Netflix, you have like these kinds of okay, are you actually still watching? It's trying to keep you engaged, and where do you it's like where you draw the line between the user's needs, which is like okay, I want to be entertained, versus the company's needs. Okay, I need to keep users entertained enough so like that they don't cancel their subscriptions or that they upgrade their subscriptions. So like these kinds of questions. And I think we all experienced that, where basically systems are designed like to help us 80% of the time, but then you have like these weird interactions where you're like, huh, why is it doing Reddit? Why is it doing that? Why is it not supporting it, but rather than designed in a way that I have to follow a certain pattern? And this is basically what we call in human-computer interaction the application of dark and deceptive designs, where basically systems are designed to trick you, the user, into certain behaviors so that you are revealing informations, buying certain products, or basically it's like using certain applications. And there's like this kind of, you probably have enough examples already in your mind when it comes to like these kinds of naggings, like you're trying to book on Ryanair a flight, and then it's like you have only 3 minutes left, and then this big special is gone. The obstruction, where basically it's like you have to wait 5 minutes until you can download this paper. Sneaking, where you basically is like the travel insurance is already pre-selected for you or the car. The interference, where basically is like the more expensive product is placed higher in the design. And then, of course, forced action, where basically the system is enforcing you to do an update. So, for example, Windows right now is keep nagging me that I have to shut down my system in 5 minutes, other because there's an update. So I need to keep my talk quite short. Another point, which is like very important for you also to consider, is this kind of the privacy of mental health applications and tools. Now, normally, I'm giving an example about like how you basically can combine social media data and your Zoom images as a way to connect when I'm connecting these two dots, that I can basically get out of your data where you live, your job, etc., etc., etc. It's like these kinds of combinations where basically it's like the more data I'm putting outside, or it's like revealing and bleeding into the void, the higher the risk is, of course, that I'm falling for potential harms. Oops, sorry, correction. And then, of course, we have like we talked about digital games, but then like the design patterns which we had before is like, okay, bring people, be creatives, like have this kind of playful design. And then it's like what we see here is right now is like also the shift where basically controversial and problematic industries are adapting these kinds of design paradigms, which researchers in HCI are focusing on for children, that they are basically get reapplied, for example, for gambling. And for example, in Germany, for a long time, these kinds of gambling machines were open for children at 6 years old because it's basically classified as an adventure rather than actually like a gambling machine. And this is something which is something why I'm saying it's like the key takeaway for me and in this talk is basically digital technology is something which is not just like a black box. It is something which is human made, and there's like always somebody behind it who has an idea what the system is supposed to do. And there's like, of course, something which you should become aware of. This kind of okay, what are they? How they're designed, and how can I use them, and how the data and how is the safety designed for it. So I'm slightly overdrawn, so I'm stopping here now and ready
Thanks so much,
for questions.
Martin. Yeah, thanks so much, Martin, for that fascinating and illuminating talk. So yes, questions, specific questions for Martin, but also if you have just more general points, questions you'd like to raise, just relevant to the whole topic of our session today, please either post in the chat or raise your hand and ask. I wonder if I could jump in while people are organizing their thoughts there and ask something, I think to both of you, but it was sort of prompted, Martin, on your slide about, I think it was about playful design. One of the principles was adopt ethical commercial exploitation. And I'm
Mm.
quite conscious, it seems to me, that so much of the sort of social media space is controlled by quite a small number of companies, Meta, Snapchat, TikTok, and so on, which are commercial companies, some of which appear to be run by people with very particular political positions. So it seems to me there's a huge, given you're saying about the pervasiveness and the power of these technologies, there seems to be a huge amount of power focused in the hands of quite a small number of people who are maybe accountable to their shareholders, but not necessarily to the wider community. What is your take on how that might be driving um, youth mental health?
Um, I think it's like you're putting on you're addressing a very important point, which is like also one of my important missions around like this kind of digital resilience and resistance to algorithmic pushes. Like for example, if you think about, you saw it on Twitter when Twitter basically turned into X, and then basically it's like this shift from okay, we're trying to be a marketplace to a lot of ideas into this what it is now. Um, And I think it is something like we have this ideas like and technology is something which can be on one side quite powerful and empowering. We saw that with social media in certain civil rights movements, but then on the other side, you have like the technology can easily be also become abused and used against the users, like what we're having right now, what we're facing right now, for example, with all the AI slop, for example, where basically it's like, yes, you can use AI to create cool things and it can become quite helpful, it's like to code and to empower users to express themselves through new ways. But then on the other side, because it becomes so easy, it becomes also quite easy to deceive people. And basically saying it's like, okay, I'm enacting somebody else right now. So, and I think that is something um, which which is very concerning how quick basically it's like these kinds of political agendas or like political questions are pushable into these digital systems and ecosystems that there's like within 1 week or within 1.5 weeks basically it's like a lot of these social media platforms changed, and so these kinds of questionable movements within the digital spaces. And maybe stop sharing so we can.
Yeah. Thank you. Mark, did you want to come in on that question?
Yeah, it just I put a quote at the front of the lecture that I just wanted to shoehorn in because I didn't really know where to put it, but it was by Neil Postman who talked about well, actually referenced someone before, but it's improved means to unimproved ends. I think technologically we've got very sophisticated at manipulating and influencing, but the underlying values that they're serving, are really not good because the power is consolidated with people with I think, quite nefarious ends. So I think there is this real misalignment between the incentives that are built into these technologies and individual interests. And I mean, not, well, I suppose I am being pessimistic. I don't have massive faith in the companies taking on accountability and shifting that, which I think is a real problem, which is why I think it's great that we're pushing for, like, you're seeing something like Grok at the moment, like pushing for to somehow manage that, the UK government's response to that. But I'm skeptical because there is so much power. And I don't know if I don't know if anyone's read Shoshana Zuboff's Digital Surveillance, but she talks about the model of just kind of shifting. The legal process is so slow that these companies just keep shifting and moving so they can avoid, corporate responsibility and oversight. So yeah, I agree
It is.
completely.
It is something interesting, like about the corporate responsibility when you think about like again, it's like I'm using the games because they are rather quick when it comes to like these kinds of payment models. So they started with unethical or like with questionable patterns in how to finance their games, and it's like then the political push was like the legislation push came to ban these things like loot boxes or whatever. And then it's like from one day to another, it's like these kinds of loot boxes disappeared and were replaced with something even worse. So what is interesting there is like in something which I see the academic role both in the computer science and in the clinical psychology space to become more the critiques and like this kind of yes, like the pushback against these kinds of questionable designs and like also like saying like, okay, we need to rethink how technology is evaluated. It's like, yes, the legislation can say it's like it needs to be safe, but what does this mean? It's like how can you actually like evaluate safety in such a short amount of time? Like if you think just a simple example, like how quick, so like how long it took from how much time they had to evaluate the phone, and nowadays like how less time we have like in the evaluation of AI models. It's like how quick basically it's like these iterations happening.
Yeah, thank you. Right. So you've got any questions, either by raising your hand or typing something in the chat?
On comments.
Mm.
I think in that case, I'll take my chance to ask sort of another question. I mean, one of the impressions I've got from listening to both of your talks is that as workers in this field, one of the challenges you must face is the sort of liquidity of the thing that you're studying, right? It changes and it evolves at a very rapid pace, and presumably in ways that are meaningful to young people's mental health. I mean, just to jump in on a really big shift, I suppose, is sometimes when you've spoken today, you've sort of talked about AI and social media as sort of one thing, and sometimes you've spoken about them as two different things. Uh, what do you think AI is in terms of an additional, both challenge but also potential benefit to mental health, above and beyond social media? What do you think might be distinctive about it as an influence in this area?
Do you want to go, Martin, or do you want me to?
I think from an engineering perspective, it's basically blessing and curse at the same time. On one side, I think it is a quite powerful tool to help, like all these kinds of what I said, like these kinds of computing approaches, like how can we make sense of data and like behavior. I think that's quite powerful. Where I think, and it's also something which can help to like make systems more accessible. So, like for example, when people are trying to express ideas or something like that, they can use AI systems like say, okay, I want to say this and this and this, but I don't know how. So like these kinds of LLMs. Then there's like also, of course, I'm skeptical when it comes to that it can completely replace us like yeah, it's like replace like this kind of empathetic therapist patient relationship, but it can basically it's like become a sub support systems, like almost like as a sort of training system. For example, you can say like where you can simulate interactions and something like that, where you're saying, okay, this is not a real human, but it's gonna behave like that. So like now you can learn like that. It's like, but like selling it or right now it's like at the current capacities, I think it is highly oversold. Like it can do stuff. Is it good? It's like let's say it's like for repetitive things like these kinds of simple tasks. But like when it comes to the more sophisticated aspects, which mental health is like one of the most difficult ones, I think it becomes quite falling flat.
I guess from my side, I like to be the contrarian, and I'll take the pessimistic sort of focus on the harms more. I think there potentially are benefits, but so a collaborator I'm working with, and I won't. Her name's Ashley. I won't try and pronounce her full name because I will absolutely murder it. But basically, she's written this lovely paper. She talks about the shift from an AI from an attention economy, as people have been talking a lot about social media, really geared to tune in to capture your attention and maximize attention engagement. She talks about an AI mediated intimacy economy. And I think that is something. I think that it's the sort of, in some ways, one part of it is like social media on steroids. Like it really, if social media hacks into these sort of evolutionary impulses for status and connection, I think AI and the kind of humanizing, personifying aspects of it that are really trying to elicit your empathy and your connection and really kind of mimic human behaviors. I think that's a problem. Well, I mean, I think we're yet to see how much of a problem, but I think in terms of cultivating dependency and cultivating more and more interaction, it is creating these sort of frictionless interactions that are like another step, another level of trying to, impact to drive engagement. So I think that's one aspect. Um, I think the other aspect is, I mean, when we talk about AI, I think we often talk about lots of different things. So there's the kind of recommender algorithms, which is one thing, which is underpinning a lot of the problems we're talking about. That sort of amplification of sort of very emotive and diverse, separating material. But then there is also sort of AI chatbots and that sort of thing. And I think we're just yet to see the range and scope of impacts that has. But I think it is potentially very worrying. But I also think, as Martin said, I think it sounds like there's masses of hype, and it sounds like, I mean, if following the news, everyone's talking about the bursting of the AI bubble, and I think there has been a lot of hype because it serves interests again, doesn't it, of those corporations? It leads to massive investment. Fund us because this is a really helpful technology, and fund us because it's a really terrible technology. And if we don't develop it, then those evil people over there will. So I think either way, they kind of win. But yeah, I think it's just so integrated now into social media. It's difficult to disentangle them.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Before we finish, does anybody have anything they'd like to add or ask?
They're all just scrolling their social media sort of profiles. That's why they're zoned out and they're just
Get off your phone, people! Pay attention to class.
Essie.
No, just fascinating talks and saying I'm not scrolling my social media.
Excellent. Yeah, such a great session. Just so much food for thought, and these are the waters that we all swim in and will be swimming in for many years to come, and so just so integral to thinking about promoting well-being and mental health of children and young people and of people across the lifespan. So thanks so much for getting us all thinking about that. Just before we finish, it just remains for me to sort of highlight the message that Sabrina put in the chat. So the next session in these Catalyst seminars will actually be an in-person event timed for Children's Mental Health Week. We'll be discussing approaches to promote children's mental health and well-being. So I really hope to see lots of you there, and there's the Eventbrite link if you're interested in coming to that. So thank you so much, Marc and Martin, for our talks, and I hope you all have a good rest of your day, whether or not you decide to spend it scrolling through Instagram. So thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks for having us. Thank you.
Thank you very much.